The screaming stopped at exactly 3:15 in the morning on September 8, 1872, but the sound of picks striking stone never did. Deep in the hollows of eastern Kentucky, where fog clings to mountain ridges like secrets in coal dust, settles in lungs like prayers, the workers at Thornbrook Mine had learned that some shifts never ended. What they discovered in the depths that night would remain buried for over a century, not because the evidence was destroyed, but because those who survived chose to forget what they'd helped create. In 1868, when the war's bitter taste still lingered in Confederate mouths and Reconstruction carved new scars across the South, Ebenezer Draycott arrived in the nameless hollow that would become his kingdom. The coal seams ran thick beneath these mountains, black gold waiting for the right man with the right methods to extract every ounce. Draycott was that man, though the methods he would employ went far beyond simple mining. He purchased 17,000 acres of mountain land for the price of a decent carriage, built his manor house on the highest ridge, where morning mist never reached, and began recruiting workers with promises no honest man should have been able to keep. The sound that echoed through Devil's Backbone Ridge that first winter was not the ring of hammers on steel, but something softer, more deliberate. It was the sound of bone meeting stone, of flesh learning to yield, and of voices that started as protests but ended as whispers. Draycott's operation grew with unnatural speed. While other mine operations struggled to find reliable labor, his workforce swelled to over 300 souls within 2 years. Men arrived desperate, families followed, and children learned to work before they learned to read. But those who tried to leave discovered that Draycott's generosity came with chains that extended far beyond the mine shafts. The manor itself perched on the ridge like a cancer, its Gothic towers and iron-trimmed windows designed to watch every movement in the valley below. 12 bedrooms, a ballroom that never hosted balls, and a basement with rooms that appeared on no architect's plans. Draycott lived alone save for his housekeeper, Philomena, a rail-thin woman with eyes like winter who never spoke above a whisper but seemed to hear conversations through stone walls. The townspeople who delivered supplies noticed things: thick curtains that never opened, the smell of carbolic acid mixed with something organic and sweet. Most unsettling, the sounds that drifted down the mountain on still nights, not screams exactly, but something worse, the absence of sound where there should have been voices. What made Draycott's operation different was not just the coal it extracted, but what it extracted from the people who worked there. Families arrived as units but were separated immediately. Husbands sent to the deepest shafts, wives assigned to the sorting houses, children placed in dormitories where education consisted of learning to sort coal by grade and to never ask questions about the empty beds that appeared each morning. The company store extended credit that somehow never decreased, no matter how much was paid. Workers discovered that leaving meant abandoning spouses, children, or elderly parents who had become collateral in transactions they never remembered agreeing to. Local physician Cornelius Harkwell kept meticulous records during his monthly visits to the mining camp, and his journal entries from 1870 paint a picture of systematic degradation that he seemed powerless to stop. "The children grow smaller each month," he wrote in March of that year, "not from hunger, but from something that eats at them from within. They do not play, they do not laugh, they watch constantly, as if waiting for permission to breathe." By 1871, Harkwell's visits had decreased to quarterly, then stopped entirely. His final entry, dated December 15, 1871, contained only 4 words: "God forgive what we allow." The transformation of the hollow accelerated through 1871. What had begun as a mining operation evolved into something that resembled a feudal estate, where Draycott ruled not just through economic control, but through a system of dependencies and favors that created a web of complicity extending far beyond the mountain. Regional officials received generous donations. local sheriffs found their debts mysteriously forgiven. Ministers discovered their churches suddenly blessed with new bells, stained glass, and hymnals, all bearing small brass plaques crediting the generosity of the Thornbrook mining concern. The coal production reports submitted to state authorities showed remarkable efficiency, but independent observers noted something impossible. The amount of coal extracted exceeded what the documented workforce should have been able to produce, even working around the clock. When questioned, Draycott would smile and speak of innovative techniques, of motivation methods learned from European mining operations, of the remarkable dedication shown by Appalachian families when given proper guidance and incentive. Some still rest beneath the mountain. What those reports never mentioned was the sound that began echoing through the shafts in the deepest hours before dawn, a rhythmic percussion that was not the striking of tools against coal, but something organic and deliberate. The few workers who survived long enough to speak of it described it as the sound of teaching, of lessons being learned in chambers that appeared on no mining charts. They spoke of voices that started human, but ended as something else, and of instructions delivered in Draycott's cultured English accent that transformed workers into instruments of his expanding vision. But in the early hours of September 8th, 1872, something went wrong in the depths of Thornbrook Mine. The screaming that had become as regular as shift changes suddenly stopped, and in the silence that followed, the mountain itself seemed to exhale. What emerged from those tunnels would force even Draycott's most loyal enablers to confront what they had helped create. And what they discovered would be so unspeakable that they would spend the next century ensuring it remained buried. Before we descend into those tunnels and uncover what the master of Thornbrook truly built beneath the mountain, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. The isolation of these mountains can feel crushing even through a screen, and I want to know you're safely in the light while we explore the darkness together. Give this video a like if you're ready to face what history tried to forget, and subscribe because some truths can only be told once the last witnesses are gone. The children were always the first to disappear, and on that September morning, even the mountain would not hide what Draycott had done to them. The smell of copper pennies filled the air as Horatio Bramblehurst stumbled from Shaft 7 at dawn, his lamp casting wild shadows against tunnel walls that seemed to weep. Behind him, the silence stretched like a held breath, broken only by the steady drip of something that was definitely not water onto the wooden support beams. What the mine foreman had discovered in the deepest chambers would transform him from Draycott's most loyal overseer into a broken man who spent his remaining years speaking only to warn others away from Devil's Backbone. Ridge. The morning of September 8th, 1872, marked the end of Draycott's most ambitious experiment and the beginning of a cover-up that would span generations. For 4 years, the master of Thornbrook had been perfecting what he called his educational methodologies, a system that transformed desperate families into something far more valuable than mere laborers. The children who vanished were not victims of accidents or runaways, but graduates of a program that existed in chambers carved so deep into the mountain that their screams became whispers before reaching the surface. Bramblehurst's shift log, recovered decades later from a sealed mine office, detailed the morning's discoveries with the mechanical precision of a man refusing to process what his eyes had witnessed. 0630 hours, Shaft 7 obstruction reported. Investigated with lantern crew of 4. Found classroom arrangement. 37 desks. 37 small chairs, all occupied. The entry continued for 3 pages, each line more clinical than the last, until the handwriting deteriorated into illegible scratches and the final words, "They were so quiet, so very quiet." The classroom Bramblehurst discovered represented the culmination of Draycott's vision. Children as young as 5 had been systematically separated from their families and subjected to what the mine owner termed advanced conditioning protocols. Using techniques he claimed to have learned during travels. Through European institutions, Draycott had created an underground network of chambers where traditional education was replaced with something far more sinister. The children learned to read, but only documents related to mining quotas. They learned mathematics, but only calculations involving extraction, efficiency, and workforce optimization. Most disturbing were the behavioral modifications. Children who had arrived at Thornbrook displaying normal childhood traits, curiosity, playfulness, defiance, emerged as hollow-eyed automatons who responded to verbal commands with mechanical precision. Parents who inquired about their children were told they were receiving specialized training that would benefit the entire family's economic prospects. Those who pressed for details found their own work assignments shifted to the most dangerous sections of the mine, accidents that could be attributed to their failure to follow safety protocols. The education never truly stopped. Celestine Marwood, wife of a shaft supervisor, maintained a secret diary throughout 1871 that provides the only surviving first-person account of life within Draycott's compound. Her entries reveal a community that had learned to function through willful blindness and collective silence. "The Thornton boy came back today," she wrote in August. "Sarah says he looks well-fed and clean, but there's something in his eyes like looking into a deep well. He speaks only when spoken to, and his words come out measured, like he's reciting lessons. When I asked him about his schooling, he smiled and said, 'I am learning to be useful, Mrs. Luder.'" Marwood. Master Draycott says, useful children become valuable adults. The transformation process typically took between 8 and 14 months, depending on what Draycott termed the child's natural resistance level. Younger children adapted more quickly, their personalities more malleable under sustained pressure. Older children, particularly those who had shown leadership qualities or independence, required more intensive interventions. These took place in chambers that Bramblehurst's crew discovered were equipped with restraining devices disguised as furniture, acoustic dampening materials installed behind decorative wall panels, and detailed charts tracking individual psychological responses to various stimuli. By 1871, Draycott's operation had achieved something unprecedented in American labor history: a completely compliant workforce that policed itself. Parents who had been conditioned through economic dependence worked alongside children who had been conditioned through psychological manipulation. The result was a mining operation that produced triple the regional average while maintaining accident rates so low they attracted attention from state mining inspectors. What those inspectors never discovered was that accidents had not decreased. They had simply been redefined. When children died during the conditioning process, their deaths were recorded as mining accidents. When adults questioned the program too aggressively, they experienced accidents that served as object lessons to others. When outside authorities expressed interest in the operation's remarkable efficiency, they were invited to tour facilities that had been carefully prepared to showcase model working conditions, while the actual conditioning chambers remained hidden behind false walls and sealed entrances. The system might have continued indefinitely if not for what happened in the pre-dawn hours of September 8th. According to Bramblehurst's increasingly erratic logs, a group of newly conditioned children had been assigned to night shift duties in Shaft 7 when something went catastrophically wrong. The exact nature of the incident remains unclear, but the aftermath suggested that even Draycott's most successful subjects retained some core humanity that could, under extreme duress, reassert itself. What emerged from those tunnels at sunrise was not the orderly procession of conditioned workers Draycott expected, but something that challenged the very foundations of his carefully constructed system. The children had remembered how to scream, and in remembering, they had awakened something in the adult workers that years of economic conditioning had tried to suppress. For the first time since the operation began, the mountain itself seemed to recoil from what was happening in its depths. But Draycott was not a man who accepted failure. And what happened next would prove that the master of Thornbrook was willing to sacrifice everything: his workers, his operation, even his own humanity, rather than allow his life's work to be exposed. How far would a community go to protect its economic survival when faced with evidence of systematic horror? And what happens when children refuse to stay silent about what adults have chosen to ignore? The answer lay buried beneath tons of carefully placed rubble, waiting for someone brave enough to move the stones. The dynamite charges detonated at 11:47 a.m., sending tremors through bedrock that registered on seismographs as far away as Charleston. Within minutes, 4 years of carefully constructed tunnels and chambers became tons of impassable rubble, sealing evidence that would take over a century to unearth. What the residents of Devil's Backbone Ridge witnessed that morning was not a mining accident, but the systematic erasure of witnesses to crimes that had no legal precedent in American jurisprudence. Draycott's response to the September 8th incident revealed the true scope of his preparation for exactly this contingency. The man who had spent 4 years conditioning children and manipulating adults had also spent considerable effort planning what he termed his dissolution protocol, a comprehensive system for eliminating all evidence of his operation while maintaining the appearance of tragic accident. The explosive charges had been pre-positioned throughout the mine complex months earlier, disguised as standard safety equipment, and accessible through a series of triggers that could be activated from his manor house study. The morning after the tunnel collapse, Ambrose Coldwater, the regional mine inspector, arrived to investigate what appeared to be the worst mining disaster in Kentucky history. His initial report, filed 3 days later, described a catastrophic structural failure caused by improper timber supports and excessive extraction in unstable geological conditions. What Coldwater's report omitted was his private meeting with Draycott the evening before filing, a conversation that took place in the Manor House library over brandy and cigars that lasted until well past midnight. Coldwater's personal effects, discovered in his Baltimore home after his death in 1903, included a leather portfolio containing documents that told a different story. Receipts for payments totaling $8,000 from the Thornbrook mining concern. Deeds to property in 3 different states. Most damning, a handwritten note in Draycott's distinctive script. Inspector Coldwater understands that mining is dangerous work and that sometimes the mountain claims what belongs to it. He also understands that his own family's welfare depends upon his continued discretion regarding matters beyond his expertise. The cover-up extended far beyond simple bribery. Within weeks of the collapse, family members of the buried workers began receiving visits from representatives of something called the Appalachian Benevolent Society, a charitable organization that had never existed before September 8th, but possessed remarkable resources for assisting bereaved families. Widows discovered their debts forgiven, and their children enrolled in boarding schools in distant cities. Surviving workers found employment in mining operations across 3 states, always with the understanding that discussion of their Thornbrook experiences would result in immediate termination and blacklisting throughout the region. The mountain swallowed their voices whole. Those who accepted the society's assistance disappeared into new lives with new names, their Thornbrook years becoming blank spaces in carefully reconstructed histories. Those who initially refused the offers discovered that their options rapidly narrowed. Arabella Wexford, widow of a shaft supervisor, attempted to contact state authorities about the true circumstances of the collapse. Within days, her 12-year-old son vanished from their temporary lodging house. He reappeared a week later, clean, well-fed, and speaking in the same measured cadence that had characterized Draycott's conditioned children. When asked about his absence, the boy smiled and explained that he had been invited to visit a special school where he had learned valuable lessons about the importance of family loyalty and the dangers of spreading untrue stories. The transformation was complete, and irreversible. Arabella never spoke publicly about Thornbrook again, and her son grew into a man who became a successful businessman, generous community leader, and devoted family man who never, under any circumstances, discussed his childhood or allowed his own children to ask questions about their grandfather's death. The efficiency of Draycott's dissolution protocol depended not just on financial incentives and implied threats, but on the community's desperate need to believe that what they had witnessed was simply a tragic accident. The alternative, acknowledging that they had enabled 4 years of systematic horror through their silence and complicity, required a level of moral reckoning that most found unbearable. It was easier to accept the narrative of structural failure and unfortunate timing than to confront their own responsibility for what had happened in those buried chambers. Local religious leaders played crucial roles in solidifying the acceptable version of events. Reverend Elias Thornbrook, whose name had been given to the mine in honor of his early support for Draycott's operation, delivered a series of sermons throughout the fall of 1872 that emphasized the Christian duty to accept God's mysterious ways and to resist the temptation to question divine judgment through earthly investigation. His Sunday services became community therapy sessions where grief was channeled into acceptance and suspicion transformed into resignation. The few who continued asking uncomfortable questions found themselves increasingly isolated. Dr. Time Semper Harkwell, who had documented the children's deterioration in his medical journals, suffered what appeared to be a stroke in October 1872. He recovered his physical capabilities, but never again demonstrated the intellectual clarity that had made his observations so precise. His medical practice declined as patients began seeking treatment from a new physician, Dr. Aurelia Kingswell, whose treatments focused on helping families move forward rather than dwelling on past tragedies. By Christmas of 1872, Devil's Backbone Ridge had achieved a collective amnesia so complete that new residents arriving in the area heard only vague stories about an unfortunate mining accident that had claimed many lives but had ultimately demonstrated the community's remarkable resilience. The sealed mine entrances became landmarks that children were told to avoid, not because of what they contained, but because of the structural instability that had caused the original collapse. Draycott himself seemed to age decades. In the months following September 8th, neighbors reported seeing him walking the ridgetop at all hours, sometimes carrying a lantern, sometimes simply standing motionless in the darkness. His interactions with the remaining community members became formal and distant, as if he were already preparing for his own departure from the hollow that had become his kingdom and his tomb. But the master of Thornbrook had not spent 4 years perfecting his techniques simply to abandon them in the face of a single setback. What the community interpreted as withdrawal was actually preparation, and what they assumed was remorse was actually planning. What would you do if you discovered that your entire community had been built on a foundation of buried children and silenced witnesses, and that the man responsible was not finished with his work? The answer would emerge in the spring of 1873, when Draycott unveiled the final phase of his grand design. Steam hissed from the locomotive's brakes as it pulled into Hazard Station on March 15, 1873, carrying 27 children whose parents believed they were being transported to prestigious boarding schools in Virginia. The manifest listed their destination as the Kingswell Academy for Exceptional Youth, an institution that existed only in Draycott's carefully forged documents and the desperate hopes of families seeking better futures for their offspring. What awaited these children at the end of their journey would prove that the master of Thornbrook had learned valuable lessons from his previous operation's premature exposure. The collapse of the mine had not ended Draycott's work, but had instead taught him the fatal flaw in his original design: containment. Operating within a single geographic location had made his activities vulnerable to discovery and his subjects susceptible to collective resistance. The solution, he realized, was distribution, a network of smaller operations spread across multiple states, each appearing independent while serving his larger vision of what he termed human agricultural development. The Kingswell Academy occupied a converted mansion 30 miles south of Lexington, its columned facade and manicured grounds presenting the image of educational excellence that wealthy families expected from a premier institution. What distinguished it from legitimate schools was not its curriculum, which appeared rigorous and comprehensive, but its selection criteria. Only children who had demonstrated what Draycott classified as excessive individuality were invited to attend. These were the questioners, the rebels, the young minds that refused to accept authority without examination. Dr. Aurelia Kingswell, the Academy's headmistress, had been carefully recruited from the ruins of Thornbrook's medical staff. Her credentials were impeccable, her references glowing, and her understanding of Draycott's methodologies complete. Under her supervision, the Academy's educational program focused on what she termed behavioral optimization through structured learning experiences, a euphemism for techniques that broke down individual resistance through systematic isolation, controlled stress, and carefully calibrated reward systems. The Academy's daily schedule reflected Draycott's evolved understanding of psychological conditioning. Unlike the crude physical restraints employed in the mine's underground chambers, Kingswell's methods relied on social manipulation and environmental control. Children were housed in dormitories, where privacy was eliminated and peer monitoring was encouraged through competitive reward systems. Academic success was measured not by intellectual achievement, but by conformity to behavioral expectations that grew increasingly specific and arbitrary. Their laughter died in measured doses. Parents who inquired about their children's progress received detailed progress reports, documenting remarkable improvements in discipline, focus, and academic performance. What these reports omitted was that the improvements were measured against baseline behaviors that had been artificially suppressed through techniques that would not be formally recognized by psychology professionals for another 2 centuries. Children learn to excel by learning to disappear, to achieve by abandoning the very qualities that had made them exceptional in the first place. The Academy's success attracted attention from educational reformers across the region, who sought to understand Kingswell's revolutionary approaches to childhood development. Visiting delegations toured carefully prepared facilities where model students demonstrated remarkable poise, articulate responses to complex questions, and unanimous enthusiasm for their educational experience. These demonstrations were not fraudulent. The children genuinely believed every word they spoke, having been conditioned to experience their suppressed individuality as a form of illness from which they had been cured. By autumn of 1873, Draycott had established similar institutions in Tennessee, West Virginia, and North Carolina, each operating under different names and managed by carefully selected administrators who believed they were pioneering advanced educational techniques. The network's distributed nature made detection nearly impossible, while its standardized methods ensured consistent results across all locations. Children who completed the program emerged as ideal citizens, obedient, productive, and incapable of questioning the systems that controlled their lives. The transformation process had been refined to eliminate the physical evidence that had compromised the Thornbrook operation. There were no underground chambers, no restraining devices, no obvious signs of coercion. Instead, children were broken through methods that left no marks: sleep deprivation disguised as academic rigor, nutritional manipulation presented as dietary discipline, and social isolation framed as character development. Parents visiting their children found them healthy, well-educated, and seemingly content, never suspecting that contentment itself had been artificially manufactured. The network's most insidious innovation was its self-sustaining recruitment system. Graduated students became teachers, administrators, and community leaders who identified suitable candidates for the program while maintaining absolute loyalty to its principles. They married other graduates, raised children according to academy methods, and created communities where Draycott's vision of human optimization spread naturally through social structures rather than institutional force. A sample of correspondence between academy administrators, recovered from a sealed vault beneath the original Kingswell building in 1957, reveals the systematic nature of the operation. Subject demonstrates continued resistance to Protocol 7 implementation. Recommend transfer to Tennessee facility for advanced behavioral restructuring. Previous subjects with similar profiles have shown complete compliance following 6-month intensive treatment. Anticipate delivery of replacement candidate within 2 weeks. The letters were signed with initials only, but handwriting analysis conducted in the 1960s confirmed that all correspondence originated from the same source, a source whose writing matched samples from Ebenezer Draycott's personal papers. The master of Thornbrook had not retreated following the mine collapse, but had instead expanded his operation to a scale that made his original work appear limited by comparison. By 1874, over 800 children had passed through the network's various facilities. Their families, spread across 5 states, had no knowledge of each other's existence, and no reason to suspect that their children's remarkable transformations were anything other than the natural result of superior education. The graduates themselves retain no conscious memory of their conditioning, having been taught to interpret their experiences as positive personal growth rather than systematic manipulation. But success on such a scale inevitably created new vulnerabilities, and Draycott's network was about to encounter a threat he had not anticipated. A survivor from the original Thornbrook operation who had spent 2 years planning his revenge. What happens when someone who understands your methods turns those same techniques against you? And how do you fight an enemy who knows exactly how you think because you taught him how to think that way? The answer was approaching Devil's Backbone Ridge in the company of federal marshals who had been convinced that the most dangerous man in America might not be the one they were hunting, but the one who had sent them to hunt him. The federal marshals' horses struggled through mud that sucked at their hooves like hungry mouths as they climbed the ridge toward Draycott's manor on October 12, 1874. Leading them was a man whose face bore the pale, hollow-eyed marks of someone who had learned to survive by forgetting how to feel, yet whose memory remained sharp enough to guide lawmen through mountain passes that appeared on no official maps. What the marshals did not know was that their guide had spent 2 years learning to think like the man they were hunting, because he had been taught by that man to think in the first place. The survivor's name was Thomas Millwright, though that identity had been carefully constructed to hide the fact that he was one of only 3 people who had escaped the Thornbrook Mine collapse with both his life and his sanity intact. What made his survival remarkable was not luck or courage, but his unique position within Draycott's operation. He had been one of the conditioned children who had advanced far enough in the program to understand its mechanics while retaining enough of his original personality to recognize its horror. Millwright's escape had been planned over 18 months, beginning with his deliberate failure to complete the final stages of conditioning that would have eliminated his capacity for independent thought. By convincing supervisors that he required additional treatment while secretly maintaining his mental clarity, he had gained access to administrative areas where Draycott's true methods were documented in clinical detail. The journals and correspondence he had memorized during those months formed the foundation of the case he would eventually present to federal authorities. The challenge was not gathering evidence, but presenting it in terms that 19th century law enforcement could comprehend and prosecute. Child labor was common, physical punishment was accepted, and psychological manipulation was not recognized as a form of abuse. Millwright's solution was to reframe Draycott's activities in terms that federal marshals understood: interstate transportation of minors for illegal purposes, fraudulent operation of educational institutions, and conspiracy to defraud families through false representations. The documentation Millwright provided to Marshal Benjamin Hayes in Louisville painted a picture of systematic fraud operating across state lines. Forged academic credentials, falsified student progress reports, and financial records showing payments for services that were never rendered. What the marshals did not realize was that Millwright had deliberately focused their attention on the network's administrative crimes rather than its human cost. Knowing that bureaucratic violations would provoke official response, while tales of psychological conditioning would be dismissed as fantasy. Marshal Hayes's official report, filed on September 28, 1874, summarized the federal government's interest in the case. Subject operates educational institutions under false pretenses, transports minors across state boundaries without proper documentation, and maintains fraudulent correspondence with families regarding student welfare. Recommend immediate investigation and arrest on federal charges of mail fraud and interstate transportation violations. Revenge disguised itself as justice. What Hayes's report omitted was Millwright's true motivation for seeking federal intervention. During their private meetings, the survivor had shared carefully edited accounts of his experiences that portrayed Draycott as a criminal mastermind whose methods threatened the social order itself. He doesn't just steal money from families, Millwright had explained. He steals their children's souls and sends back empty vessels wearing their faces. If this continues, we'll have a generation of young people who cannot think, cannot question, cannot resist whatever authority tells them to do. The marshals' investigation had been proceeding for 6 weeks when they discovered that their target was already aware of their approach. Letters intercepted from Draycott's network revealed a man who was not fleeing but preparing, not panicking but calculating. His correspondence with academy administrators contained coded instructions for what he termed Protocol Omega, a comprehensive plan for eliminating evidence while preserving the essential elements of his work in forms that could be quickly reestablished elsewhere. The true genius of Millwright's strategy became apparent when the marshals realized that their investigation was being quietly supported by resources they had not requested. Hotel accommodations were mysteriously arranged and paid for by anonymous benefactors. Local guides appeared at crucial moments with detailed knowledge of mountain geography. Most significantly, witnesses to Draycott's activities seemed unusually willing to cooperate with federal authorities, as if someone had spent months preparing them for exactly these interviews. Millwright had not simply provided evidence to federal marshals. He had orchestrated an entire network of support designed to ensure that their investigation would succeed where local authorities had failed. The survivors of Thornbrook, who had been scattered across multiple states, were not as isolated as they appeared. Through careful correspondence and discreet meetings, Millwright had identified others who retained memories of their experiences and convinced them that cooperation with federal authorities represented their only chance for justice. The approaching confrontation would test more than Draycott's ability to evade capture. It would determine whether techniques of psychological manipulation that had proven effective against children and desperate families could withstand scrutiny from trained law enforcement professionals who had been systematically prepared for exactly the methods Draycott would use against them. On the evening of October 11th, as the marshals made their final camp before the assault on Draycott's manor, Millwright shared intelligence that revealed the true scope of what they were facing. The master of Thornbrook had not been idle during the months since federal interest in his activities began. The manor house had been converted into what amounted to a fortress designed not for military defense, but for psychological warfare against anyone who attempted to breach its defenses. What would you do if you discovered that the man you were hunting had spent 2 years preparing not just to escape justice, but to demonstrate that his methods were so effective they could corrupt even the instruments of law and order sent to stop him? The marshals would have their answer at dawn, when they discovered that Draycott's final experiment involved not the children he had already conditioned, but the men who had come to arrest him. The manor's front door swung open at precisely 6:33 a.m. before Marshal Hayes could knock, revealing Ebenezer Draycott in a pressed black suit with silver pocket watch gleaming against his vest. The scent of fresh coffee and baked bread drifted from within, mingling with something medicinal and sharp that made the marshal's eyes water. Behind Draycott stood 12 children in identical gray uniforms, their faces serene, and their hands clasped behind their backs in perfect formation, waiting with the patience of trained animals for their master's next command. What happened in the following 3 hours would challenge every assumption federal law enforcement held about criminal behavior and demonstrate that Draycott's most dangerous weapon was not violence or intimidation, but his ability to make authority figures complicit in their own corruption. The marshals had come prepared for resistance, flight, or desperate negotiation. They were not prepared for voluntary surrender, wrapped in an offer of partnership that would test their professional integrity and personal morals in ways their training had never anticipated. Marshal Hayes stepped forward with arrest warrants drawn, but Draycott raised a single finger, not in threat, but in the gentle gesture of a teacher requesting attention from an eager student. "Gentlemen," he said, in cultured tones that carried the authority of absolute confidence, "you have traveled far and endured considerable hardship to reach this remote location. Surely courtesy demands that I offer refreshment before we attend to the tedious business that brings you here." The marshal's response revealed the first crack in their professional composure. Instead of immediately executing the warrants, Hayes found himself accepting Draycott's invitation to enter the manor's parlor, where the children served tea from silver sets with mechanical precision, while their host explained that he had been expecting this visit and had prepared what he termed a comprehensive solution to our mutual concerns. Draycott's parlor had been arranged like a courtroom, with chairs positioned to create subtle psychological dynamics that placed the marshals in positions of supplication rather than authority. The children moved through the space like extensions of their master's will, anticipating needs before they were expressed, and demonstrating levels of discipline that impressed the lawmen despite their knowledge of the methods used to achieve such compliance. The tools of corruption were served with sugar. The conversation that followed was recorded in Hayes's official report, though his account omitted crucial details that would have revealed how systematically the marshals were manipulated during their 3-hour stay. Draycott began by acknowledging the validity of every charge against him, while simultaneously reframing those charges as evidence of his commitment to advancing American education through innovative techniques that conventional institutions lacked the courage to explore. "You are correct that my methods are unconventional," he explained, while one of the children refilled the marshals' cups with tea that seemed to enhance their focus while reducing their sense of urgency. "But consider the results. These young people represent the future of American society, disciplined, productive, absolutely loyal to proper authority. In a nation still healing from civil war, can we afford to reject techniques that create such exemplary citizens simply because they challenge traditional academic approaches?" Deputy Marshal Thomas Crenshaw, who had maintained skeptical silence throughout the morning, found himself asking questions that revealed growing uncertainty about the mission's objectives. His notes, discovered in his personal effects decades later, showed a man struggling to reconcile his professional duty with an increasingly compelling argument that Draycott's work served national interests that transcended individual concerns. The children themselves became living testimony to their conditioning's effectiveness. When questioned about their experiences, they responded with articulate enthusiasm about educational opportunities that had transformed them from troubled youngsters into model students. Their accounts were internally consistent, emotionally convincing, and technically accurate. They genuinely believed every word they spoke, because their capacity to experience their situation differently had been systematically eliminated. Millwright, who had remained silent during the initial exchanges, finally spoke when he realized that the marshal's resolve was weakening. His intervention revealed the depth of Draycott's psychological manipulation and the sophistication of techniques that could corrupt trained law enforcement officers within hours of exposure. "Marshal Hayes," he said quietly, "notice how your thoughts have changed since entering this room. Notice how reasonable his arguments seem now compared to how they seemed yesterday." The observation shattered the spell that had been building around the marshals, but it also triggered Draycott's final gambit. Rather than denying Millwright's accusation, he embraced it as proof of his method's sophistication. "Mr. Millwright demonstrates precisely why my work is essential," he explained, with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student had provided the perfect example. "He has learned to resist conditioning through understanding its mechanisms, making him infinitely more valuable than someone who simply obeys without comprehension." What followed was an offer that revealed the true scope of Draycott's ambitions. He proposed to surrender himself to federal custody while transferring his network of institutions to government control, arguing that his techniques represented a strategic advantage that America could not afford to abandon to foreign powers who would certainly develop similar capabilities. The children, he suggested, could serve as both demonstration of the method's effectiveness and training cadre for expanding the program to serve national security objectives. The marshals found themselves debating not whether to arrest Draycott, but whether his offer represented an opportunity that duty required them to explore. Their professional training warred with growing conviction that they were confronting innovations that could reshape American society in ways that serve the greater good, even if individual costs seemed troubling when viewed through conventional moral frameworks. Hayes's final report to federal authorities reflected this internal conflict through language that praised Draycott's cooperation while recommending further investigation of his technique's potential applications. What the report omitted was that all four marshals had agreed to maintain discretion regarding specific details of their investigation, pending review by authorities with expertise in matters of national security. But Millwright had not survived Thornbrook's horrors and spent 2 years planning this confrontation, only to watch it transformed into recruitment opportunity for his tormentors' methods. What happens when the only person capable of exposing a master manipulator realizes that even the instruments of justice have been turned to serve his enemy's purposes, and that preventing Draycott's escape will require sacrifices that could destroy the very evidence needed to convict him? The answer lay in techniques Millwright had learned from Draycott himself, and in a final lesson about the price of absolute justice that would haunt Devil's Backbone Ridge for generations to come. The kerosene lantern shattered against the manor's oak paneling at 8:41 p.m., sending flames racing across walls, lined with Draycott's academic certificates and psychological treatises. In the sudden orange glow, Thomas Millwright stood silhouetted in the parlor doorway like an avenging angel whose wings had been clipped by too much knowledge of human darkness. Behind him, the marshals who had spent the day debating collaboration with America's most dangerous educator now faced a choice between saving the man who had corrupted them and the evidence that could expose his crimes. What the marshals could not have anticipated was that Millwright had spent 2 years not just gathering evidence against Draycott, but learning to think like him, understanding that conventional justice was inadequate when facing an enemy who could transform legal proceedings into recruitment opportunities. The fire that now consumed the manor's first floor was not an act of desperate violence, but the calculated destruction of a teacher by his most successful student. The afternoon's negotiations had revealed everything Millwright needed to know about Draycott's final strategy. The master of Thornbrook had not been preparing to flee justice, but to absorb it, transforming federal law enforcement into the distribution mechanism for his techniques on a national scale. The marshal's growing sympathy for his methods proved that even trained professionals could be conditioned within hours when subjected to techniques refined through years of practice on more vulnerable subjects. Millwright's decision to burn the manor represented more than destruction of evidence. It was the elimination of Draycott's most powerful weapon. The carefully arranged parlor, the psychologically positioned furniture, the conditioned children serving as living demonstrations, all of it designed to create an environment where resistance became impossible and collaboration seemed reasonable. With the building consumed by flames, Draycott would be reduced to what he truly was: a middle-aged man whose power depended entirely on controlling his surroundings. The children's response to the fire revealed the depth of their conditioning and the horror of what they had become. Rather than fleeing or showing fear, they formed orderly lines, awaiting instructions from their master, their faces reflecting flame light with the same serene expression they had worn while serving tea. Even as smoke filled the corridors and heat buckled the windows, they remained motionless until Draycott spoke, demonstrating loyalty so complete it transcended self-preservation. Some chains burned slower than others. Marshal Hayes's official account of the evening's events, filed 6 weeks later, described a regrettable incident in which structural damage from unknown causes had complicated the arrest of the suspect. What his report omitted was the 47 minutes during which he and his deputies stood paralyzed by moral uncertainty, while millwrights systematically destroyed the evidence they had been sent to collect, creating a situation where conviction would be impossible, even if arrest could be achieved. The marshal's paralysis was not cowardice, but the natural result of spending hours in an environment designed to undermine decisive action. Draycott's conditioning techniques worked by creating cognitive dissonance situations where multiple contradictory beliefs could be simultaneously true, leaving subjects unable to act decisively in any direction. The marshals found themselves simultaneously believing that Draycott was a dangerous criminal who must be stopped and a misunderstood innovator whose work could benefit society. Draycott's response to the fire revealed both his greatest strength and his fatal weakness. His ability to maintain absolute calm while his life's work burned around him demonstrated the psychological control that had made him so effective, but his need to preserve the children who represented his legacy prevented him from simply escaping while confusion reigned. He could not abandon his subjects because they were not just victims or tools, they were proof that his theories worked. The confrontation between Millwright and Draycott, witnessed by 4 federal marshals and 12 conditioned children, would be remembered differently by each observer. Hayes recalled a heated argument about justice and methodology. Deputy Crenshaw described a philosophical debate about the nature of human improvement. The children later testified to seeing their beloved headmaster teaching a final lesson to a disturbed former student who had never properly appreciated his educational opportunities. Only Millwright remembered what actually happened, a conversation in which Draycott offered him partnership in expanding the network to include federal law enforcement agencies, followed by Millwright's systematic deconstruction of every psychological technique his former master attempted to employ. The student had indeed surpassed the teacher, but only by becoming something that neither education nor conditioning had prepared him to be: a man who understood manipulation so completely that he was immune to its effects. The manor's collapse occurred at 9:57 p.m., sending sparks into the October sky that could be seen from valleys 20 miles away. In the aftermath, as the marshals attempted to locate survivors in the ruins, they discovered that both Draycott and 6 of the children had vanished. No bodies were recovered from the basement chambers that had been exposed by the structural collapse, despite searches that continued for 3 days. Local residents reported seeing figures moving through the mountain forests in the weeks following the fire, sometimes adults, sometimes children, always traveling in small groups that maintained perfect formation even while navigating difficult terrain. These sightings decreased over the winter months, but they never stopped entirely. Even decades later, hunters and travelers would occasionally encounter individuals whose behavior suggested exposure to Draycott's conditioning techniques. The federal investigation concluded with charges dismissed due to lack of evidence, suspects deceased or missing, and witnesses whose testimony proved too inconsistent for prosecution. Hayes's final report recommended that the case be classified as closed, but his private correspondence with Justice Department officials suggested that the matter remained unresolved in ways that could not be addressed through conventional legal channels. Millwright disappeared into the same mountain wilderness where Draycott and his remaining subjects had vanished. But unlike them, he left no trace of his passage and no evidence of his survival. The man who had orchestrated the federal investigation and destroyed the evidence that could have convicted his tormentor became as much a ghost as the children whose voices still echoed through sealed mine shafts. What happens to a community when it discovers that the man who promised to save them from a monster had become something even more dangerous than what they feared, and that the only witness to his transformation had vanished into mountains that never give up their secrets? The answer would emerge over the following century, as Devil's Backbone Ridge learned that some fires create more darkness than the shadows they were meant to burn away. The limestone caves beneath Devil's Backbone Ridge echo with the sound of children reciting lessons that were never written in any textbook, their voices drifting through passages that connect to mining tunnels sealed for over a century. Spelunkers who ventured too deep into the mountain's heart report encountering classroom arrangements carved into living rock, complete with desks sized for small bodies and instructional materials that crumble to dust when exposed to flashlight beams. What they discover in those chambers suggests that Ebenezer Draycott's final lesson plan was not destroyed in the manor fire, but relocated to a venue where interruption would be impossible, and graduation ceremonies could continue indefinitely. The transformation of Devil's Backbone Ridge in the decades following the 1874 fire reflected a community's desperate attempt to forget what it had enabled and witnessed. The regional authorities who investigated the incident concluded that Draycott had perished in the blaze, along with his victims, a determination that allowed survivors to construct new narratives about tragic accidents and unfortunate misunderstandings. But the evidence suggests that both the master of Thornbrook and his most dangerous student had simply moved their conflict to a more private venue. Local death records from 1875 through 1880 show an unusual pattern of disappearances involving individuals who had been associated with the Thornbrook operation or the federal investigation. Horatio Bramblehurst, the mine foreman who had discovered the underground classrooms, was found at the bottom of a mine shaft in April 1875, his body positioned as if he had been seated at a desk when death occurred. Marshal Hayes disappeared while conducting what he described as a routine follow-up investigation in September 1876, leaving behind only his horse and a notebook containing detailed sketches of cave systems that appeared on no geological surveys. The pattern extended beyond those directly involved in the original incident. Dr. Aurelia Kingswell, headmistress of the Tennessee Academy, was discovered in her office in 1877, seated at her desk with a pen in her hand and a half-completed letter explaining her decision to join the Master's Advanced Studies program in environmental education. Similar scenes occurred at academies across the network, always involving administrators found in classroom settings with evidence suggesting they had been conducting lessons until the moment of death. The children tell different stories now. Investigation of these incidents revealed a disturbing commonality. Each scene contained educational materials that had not been present when authorities had previously inspected the facilities. Lesson plans written in Draycott's distinctive handwriting detailed instructional methods for advanced behavioral integration in natural settings. Anatomical diagrams showed human neural pathways with annotations describing techniques for permanent educational engagement through environmental immersion. Most disturbing were the attendance records listing names of students who had supposedly died in various academy accidents, followed by notations indicating their transfer to subterranean campus, indefinite enrollment. The cave system beneath Devil's Backbone Ridge had been known to local communities for generations, but comprehensive exploration was impossible due to geological instability that made deep penetration extremely dangerous. The passages connected to abandoned mine workings, natural limestone formations, and artificial excavations whose origins were undocumented. What investigators discovered during limited exploration attempts suggested that someone had spent considerable effort expanding and connecting these underground spaces into a facility designed for long-term occupation. The most significant discovery occurred in 1902, when a geological survey team located what appeared to be a complete underground academy built into natural cave formations. Their report described classrooms carved from living rock, dormitory areas with stone beds arranged in military precision, and library spaces where books had been protected from moisture through techniques that preserved them in perfect condition. Most disturbing were the personal effects found throughout the facility: clothing sized for children and adults, writing materials, and personal journals whose final entries all ended with variations of the same phrase. The lessons continued deeper than we imagined. Physical evidence suggested that the underground facility had been occupied continuously from the 1870s through at least the early 1900s. Carbon dating of organic materials found throughout the complex indicated systematic habitation over decades, while the arrangement of living spaces suggested a community organized around educational activities that required no external contact or resources. The facility appeared designed to be completely self-sustaining, with underground water sources, food storage areas, and workshop spaces where inhabitants could produce everything necessary for extended isolation. But the most compelling evidence of continued occupation came from the discovery of what investigators termed progression records, detailed documentation of educational advancement through stages that began with conventional academic subjects but evolved into areas that had no equivalent in legitimate educational theory. The final stage, designated as environmental integration, appeared to involve techniques that eliminated the boundary between teacher and student, creating what records described as permanent learning communities adapted for optimal underground instruction. The 1902 survey team's final report contained a recommendation that the cave system be permanently sealed and the area declared off-limits to civilian access. Their justification cited geological instability that poses unacceptable risk to explorers and potential environmental hazards that could affect regional water supplies. What their report omitted was their unanimous agreement that some discoveries were too dangerous to document completely, and that certain forms of knowledge should remain buried regardless of their historical or scientific value. Contemporary residents of the region report experiences that suggest the underground community may not be entirely historical. Hikers describe encountering individuals whose behavior displays the mechanical precision characteristic of Draycott's conditioning techniques. Children playing near sealed mine entrances sometimes return home speaking in measured cadences about lessons they claim to have learned from friendly teachers who live under the mountain. Most disturbing are the reports from parents who discover that their children possess knowledge about subjects they have never been taught, demonstrated through recitation of information in voices that do not quite sound like their own. The truth about what happened to Ebenezer Draycott and Thomas Millwright may never be fully known, but evidence suggests that their final confrontation evolved into something beyond simple conflict. The underground facility appears to represent a fusion of Draycott's educational vision with Millwright's understanding of how to resist and subvert conditioning techniques. The result was a community where the boundaries between teacher and student, oppressor and victim, predator and prey became meaningless because all participants had been transformed into something that transcended those categories. What emerges from the available evidence is a picture of educational methodology that succeeded so completely it consumed its own creators, producing a learning environment where the distinction between success and failure, graduation and imprisonment, life and death became irrelevant, because the process of education itself had become the only reality that mattered. The caves beneath Devil's Backbone Ridge remain sealed, but local authorities continue to receive reports of children's voices echoing from passages that should be empty reciting lessons that should not exist in subjects that were never meant to be taught. Even now, park rangers working the night shift at nearby recreational areas report hearing what sounds like a school bell ringing deep underground at exactly 3:15 each morning, followed by the shuffling of small feet moving through corridors that connect to chambers where the most dangerous education in American history may still be in session. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.